everyone. In this presentation, History of Parallels, Part 1, we'll look at the history of Israel, basically, and the history of Christianity. And even the history before that, history from Adam until when Jacob came. Now, it's very important to understand that actually the first period, from Adam until Jacob, where God worked on a family level, we call this 2,000 years, but we call this symbolic time, because actually, from 1,600 years from Adam to Noah, for example, then we know it's 10 generations, but Adam lived to be 930, and his son would be live about the same amount of time. So therefore, if we go by that, Noah's son will still be alive at the time of flood and beyond that. But that doesn't mean it's not real time. Not time as we know it, but much longer periods of time. So it has meaning, that's why it's recorded in the Bible. They have a different calculations of time. But we call it 2,000 years symbolic time. And this is where God worked on a family level. And we call this an age of the foundation for restoration. Because restoration couldn't take place at this time until the foundation was established by Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. But it was preparation for that. After Jacob until Jesus, God worked on a national level. This is 2,000 years of image time. This is real time. We call this the age of restoration because restoration should have been accomplished completely when Jesus came. Jesus came as a Messiah. But unfortunately, he was rejected at that time and killed, and he could not complete all of his work on the earth. But he promised he would come again at the second coming. And therefore, the 2,000 years until the second coming, we call this the 2,000 years of image time again, real time, but it's prolongation of restoration because it should not have been necessary. Only became necessary because of the failure of people to accept Jesus at that time, where God worked on a world level. See, God always works on a higher level, from a family level, a national level. Even though it's 2,000 years again, God worked on a national level with Israel, but God worked on a world level in the last 2,000 years from Jesus until the present day. So we look now at the first period of time. Due to the failure of Abraham, the Israelites, as God said, would suffer 400 years of slavery in Egypt. And that came about. Jacob began this period with his 12 sons and 70 kinsmen. The conditions they set were circumcision, keeping the sacrifices, and keeping the Sabbath. This is centered on Moses and the Old Testament tabernacle. The tabernacle was a symbolic Messiah. If you remember when God, they had to keep faith in the symbolic object of faith, which is the tabernacle at the time that Moses got in the Mount Sinai. The Israelites, Moses led the Israelites into the promised land, or rather Joshua succeeding him. But it went in. Basically, it was the second generation, the internal Israelites, those born in the wilderness. All those born in Egypt all perished because of their faithlessness, except Joshua and Caleb. And they're ruled at this time by judges at that time. Now, the Israelites often forgot God's warnings. God warned them before they went to the promised land to keep faith. Keep faith in the tabernacle, keep faith in his words, but they repeatedly fell into faithlessness. And when that happened, God couldn't protect them, so often they were invaded and attacked by these Canaanite tribes. But then when they repented, God would send them a judge. Now the judge served as a prophet, chief priest and ruler. They would liberate them, lead them an army to liberate them, and then the judge would warn them to keep God's words, and they would for a while, but then repeatedly they would fall into faithlessness again. So this is the period we call period of judges of 400 years. But God wanted to have a kingdom The whole idea was God to have a kingdom in preparation to receive the Messiah. So this 120 years of united kingdom of Israel, this is based on the ideal of the temple, centering on the king. Jesus is the substantial temple. So the foundation to receive the Messiah, the foundation of faith, the central person was the king. Conditional object, the temple, and the set time was to build the temple was 40 years. Then the foundation substance would be the unity between the king in the able position, and the prophet in the Cain position. So we can see that Samuel ordained Saul king, the prophet Samuel. But Saul lost faith very quickly, sadly. He lost faith in God. So Samuel ordained David to become king. David is a very righteous person. He's famous for standing up for Israel and fighting Goliath. He's a very righteous person, but sadly he fell through adultery. He fell in love with one of his general's wives, Uriah, Bathsheba, and he committed adultery. But when he did that, God couldn't work with David again. So David failed. Solomon became king. Solomon was a very wise person, but sadly he was also invaded by sex, by fallen nature. And according to the 1 Kings 11:3, he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. So he certainly overdid it. So needless to say, God couldn't work with Solomon after that. So it's a tragic situation. We can see in this period, God really clearly wanted to bring the Messiah at that time to Israel, and then bring about the ideal world right there and then. But sadly, just like when an individual like Adam fell, he was divided into Cain and Abel, so the nation itself was divided into Cain and Abel. So we had a 400-year period of divided kingdom of north and south. The northern kingdom was in the Cain position. 10 of the 12 tribes were there, and the southern Judah in the Abel position. There's 2 tribes. So the idea of the purpose of this period was God wanted to reach out to the northern kingdom, who were influenced by the pagan practices of the Canaanites. The southern kingdom were keeping more faith through many prophets like Elijah. So Elijah was going up to the north, witnessing, evangelizing the people, but they trying to cause them to repent. It's a picture of Elijah confronting the king at that time. But they were very ruthless to drive out people like Elijah. But sadly, the northern kingdom didn't repent, and then God could not protect them anymore. So a big empire at that time, Assyria, came, invaded northern kingdom of Israel, and took them away into captivity. And there's the story for the 10 lost tribes of Israel. They never returned since. But God was still working through the southern kingdom of Judah. But sadly, the southern Judah also lost faith as well. They became influenced by the Canaanites. And then God could not protect them at the end. So another empire, Babylon, at that time, came and invaded southern Judah and took them away into captivity. But an interesting situation happened from this point. So after a period of time of being in captivity, God's way of rescuing them was a war that happened between Babylon and another empire, Persia. But Persia defeated Babylon, and the king of Persia, King Cyrus, he allowed the Jews, all the Israelites, to go back to their homeland. He even paid money to build the temple there. This is an extraordinary development. So they came back to their homeland. But you can imagine after 210 years away from their own land, their land was in ruins. They were a lost people. But we had great prophets like Malachi and many others who brought great reformation of faith to them. So he regained, inspired people that they're the chosen people. And they were part of the Roman Empire at the time. So the political territory of the Roman Empire, they're straight roads at that time. So even though they're in ruins, but God prepared the external environment for Israel, because God is preparing for the Messiah to come. So even though it's in ruins, many developments happened. It was part of the Greek Empire before, that covered this whole area. So you have the Greek language spoken everywhere. But the Greek Empire was on the wane, and the Roman Empire took over their areas. So this is very convenient use. You can imagine Messiah to come. If you had to make use of the transportation, the straight roads, and the communicate the Greek language. See, if Jesus was accepted by the people of Israel at that time, he could have very easily been accepted by the Romans. I mean, there's many stories in the Bible. The centurion asking Jesus to heal his servant, this kind of thing. But the obstacle was Israel at that time, and they did not accept him. That was a tragic thing, and of course, Jesus ended up being crucified. But we can understand this, because Paul, the Apostle Paul, much later, he spread the gospel very quickly throughout the empire because of the Greek language and the roads, straight roads. Now, it's nothing compared to our time today, but actually, when you think about it, in the ancient world, having straight roads and have a common language, that is very unique at that time. But sadly, Jesus was rejected, he was crucified, and Jesus promised to come again. Jesus promised he'll come again in the future. So this is a tragic news that Jesus was killed, but nevertheless he did die for all mankind. So he brought spiritual salvation to humanity. And Christianity itself, all the followers of Jesus, made a foundation for the second coming. So the history of Christianity follows a remarkable parallel to the history of Israel. So we'll look at this in the next presentation, part 2 of the history of parallels. Thank you very much.